Cool. All right. Talk about Filecoin public goods funding and kind of how we as a community fund what matters to us. There's going to be three parts. An intro to PGF in general for the Filecoin community. Many of you already know what PGF is, and so I'll try to introduce things that maybe you haven't heard about. Then we're going to talk about kind of the vision for Filecoin public goods funding and kind of how we've been doing that in the past and how might we do that in the future. And then I'm going to end with like some goals for 2024 and what are the kinds of things that we should be doing. So quick, what is public goods funding? This is the goal of provisioning and funding the things that we all use and are shared that can't be easily produced through private capital structures. So there are all kinds of things that are public goods that we all share, that we usually get to benefit from and leverage, but we often take for granted. You can think of a lot of software projects, especially open source projects, as classic public goods that are produced by a set of parties, given out in the open. They're non-excludable, they're non-rivalrous, and anybody can go and leverage them. And so this makes the building of software, especially open source software, kind of hard. There's all kinds of difficult structures in the provisioning and growing and maintaining of open source software. The last 10 years have been much better than the prior 10 years, and those have been better than the 10 before. But we still don't have like good structures and regenerative loops to fund open source. All kinds of important dependencies still are tragically underfunded. All kinds of problems exist because of that, and so on. The good news is that the Web3 ecosystem has been, because we get to do to make kind of programmable economies and programmable money and financial instruments and so on, we as a whole community over the last 3 to 5 years have been building new structures to build new economic components to do this provisioning of public goods, to fund the critical public goods that we all rely on. In a sense, you can think of the initial beginning of the public goods ecosystem in crypto as just the Bitcoin emission. The Bitcoin emission of funding the machines that operate the Bitcoin network is a good example of having a cryptoeconomic mechanism to fund and provision for a service that is being run for the benefit of all the participants in the network. Now, since then, we've been, as a community, exploring all kinds of interesting mechanisms and structures to do very targeted types of funding and so on. This is a pretty large community that's like all kinds of projects across the Web3 ecosystem. There's lots of really good experiments. The goal for Filecoin this year is to kind of learn from this entire ecosystem that we've been kind of helping build to now kind of do a lot of the leverage kind of like the best results that we're seeing to improve the way that we kind of fund and build Filecoin. In general, you can think of the potential. So I personally am as excited, actually way more excited about the public goods funding structure than the kind of like Web3, the normal Web3 build a new cloud computing infrastructure mission, meaning the whole Web3 mission of building a new cloud computing infrastructure that is decentralized is super ambitious, super powerful, super important for all of us. My sense is that if we can play our cards right over the next 10, 15 years, we might actually end up rewriting how economies work around the world. And that might end up like greatly eclipsing the impact of the kind of digital decentralized cloud side. So from my perspective, this is like one of the most exciting and interesting things to work on in the planet. And it's super awesome to be able to combine that with the Filecoin mission and be able to combine that with a Web3 general mission. So highly recommend the book Greenpilled. It is an extremely good introduction to public goods funding and why it matters, and specifically public goods funding in the Web3 ecosystem. It has a ton of like the good principles and foundations for how to think about it. So take the green pill and go listen to the podcast. There's lots of really good discussion there. Cool. So why do networks need to fund what matters? So you think about Filecoin and the Filecoin network, and this is a good example, similar to many other blockchains and many other communities. These are pretty large-scale, complicated economies and complicated systems with lots of different parts, lots of different components, thousands to tens of thousands of people working on them, lots of different software, lots of different services. A lot of those can be provisioned with private goods and private capital. So that's great. A lot of them can't. And a lot of the goods that make these economies work are public in nature. And so we need robust good structures to do public goods funding in these kinds of systems, in these kinds of economies. Ideally, we can create a fully regenerative funding structure where the success of this economy is funding and provisioning the success of the public goods. And that's kind of one of the most interesting and inspiring potential things that we could do in this ecosystem. If you think about the structure of a blockchain with kind of the emission of currency to kind of provide to provision for a service like running the network, if you can create a structure that's kind of like that for the provisioning and funding of public goods, you can then start funding things at massive scale. So if you think about kind of what blockchains are worth today, and you kind of imagine some optimistic case of the economies are actually growing by 10 to 100x in scale, which I think is actually like a base case kind of assumption here. I think the optimistic case is actually much larger. The scale of these economies could actually be funding public goods at the scale of nation states. So this is kind of a crazy perspective, or sorry, crazy output. But if you think about like directing, say, like 1% or 0.1% of the emission of a network to public goods, as these networks get more valuable, you can then start funding at massive scale. Now, it'd be even better to not do 1%, but to do 5%, 10%, 50%. Maybe that's too hard for a yearly emission. But if you think about structures like these kinds of like that have been proposed, like aqueducts and so on, this could yield a funding paradigm and a building paradigm and an economic paradigm that kind of like rivals the modern nation state construct, and that rivals the modern kind of like massive mega corporation construct. And so like that is super exciting. And so one of the most kind of inspiring things that I found in the last, 5-10 years. And that's kind of like why I think it's like super good to kind of mix these things. Cool. And one other kind of plug for reasoning about blockchain networks as commons. There's all kinds of principles and structures that help you govern commons better. One big part of that is kind of how do you kind of make decisions about how to use the resources. So it's not just about funding. So I want to kind of maybe say like funding is one of the key problems, but the whole other parts about how do you do like good governance about a lot of these public goods is a key component of the same kind of movement. So we're going to focus a lot of our discussion today on funding structures because that's kind of like one of the biggest pain points. But do want to flag that a good, robust managing of commons is a huge part of this. At the end of the day, like what the funding structures give us is a way to design incentive structures and design incentive gradients for lots of participants and lots of groups and so on. So we can kind of like think as a whole community what we want to achieve, and we can route incentives to what we want to achieve. Then we create an incentive gradient for people, organizations, the community as a whole to go and provision for those public goods. So think of all of what we do through these mechanisms as like warping and changing the incentive landscape to cause things to happen. There's all kinds of mechanisms that we can be playing with. The goal for this year is to kind of leverage a lot of the things that we're seeing working across the Web3 ecosystem and bring them into the Filecoin network, and then from there experiment. I kind of covered this a little bit, but kind of like in terms of funding, what matters. You first and foremost have to like think about like what matters to a particular network, and think of like the cone of what you fund being kind of like centered on like the core priorities of that network. But as your funding scale increases, you can kind of expand that scope. And so when you think about the Filecoin network and all the things that go into building it, not only are you dealing with like very local software or very local programs, you're also dealing with like dependencies deep into layers and layers and layers of software, or dependencies all the way into like fundamental science, right? And so think of like if we can kind of succeed as an economy in the large scale, then we can actually drive R&D or other kinds of programs in kind of like a very basic sense. So an example of this is the Bitcoin network incentive structure funds the massive R&D in like chip manufacturing today, in like the building out of ASICs. And that's kind of like a wasted process because those ASICs aren't very useful for other things. Imagine the Filecoin network being so significant here that it could like fund R&D in like new types of storage media, or fund R&D in like new ways of like connecting computers and so on, or fund R&D in like new kinds of ways in which humans use data and so on. So think of like, the sort of like the sky's the limit in the potential. Now, of course, you have to prioritize the things that matter most to the community and then expand the scope from there. And kind of like globally, there's all kinds of large scale coordination that we can kind of do. Great. So that's kind of like a broad intro to public goods funding. The good news here is Filecoin has been doing a lot of public goods funding since the very beginning. So I'll kind of give a quick recap. I kind of covered this already in terms of like how we think about what matters to Filecoin, but maybe I'll sort of like describe it in terms of like the mission. So think of each one of these like components about the mission of Filecoin as having very relevant public goods associated with each of these parts, and you want each of these parts to be doing well. And so we should be able to have a way of like inspecting for ourselves how are we doing across all of these goals, and then deploying and orienting our funding to go towards like better and better outcomes in these. Same with this kind of like map, right? Like we should be able to kind of evaluate how we're doing across all of these areas, and then kind of route our funding to kind of improve how lots of these things are working. And by the way, this is like not a complete map. This is like a view into a bunch of the pieces. There's of course like a lot more that doesn't even feature here. And so I would say like the Filecoin community should prioritize its public goods funding towards the things that will matter most to it, taking into account deep dependencies into other projects. One of the other things I think could be really valuable is to kind of like warp the incentive gradient to build out the things that we need for like large scale success. And so it's not just kind of like the things that you can see today are like underfunded for what we're doing now, but instead think ahead to like 2 years, 4 years, 6 years from now, map out the space of like what we need to build, and then orient funding towards solving those problems. Cool. So I'll do a super fast recap of what we've done. There's all kinds of other good reports and write-ups about what we've done elsewhere. I'll just kind of like give you like a glimpse of like the structure so far, and then kind of like talk about like how we might want to do this long term. So kind of like 2014 to 2017, a lot of the Filecoin development was funded and built by Protocol Labs, primarily in the funding of IPFS and libp2p, which are like critical dependencies that made Filecoin possible. And during that time period, we ran some grant programs. In kind of like 2017 to 2020, actually here, let me correct this. It's not just yet. In 2017 to 2020, not only did we continue doing that, but the Ethereum Foundation, Parity, and many others started like funding critical Filecoin dependencies, not just in terms of libp2p, but in terms of like EVM, because we now depend on EVM, in terms of a bunch of infrastructure in the blockchain ecosystem, and so on. Still, a lot of these systems have been like traditional grant program structures. In kind of like 2020 to 2023, we have like a huge shift where the Filecoin Foundation was founded and began operating and driving a lot of the funding and operating of the grant programs. We'll hear about that in a little bit. PL still continues funding lots of teams and projects. And now we have many other ecosystem participants also funding lots of groups. In that same time period, a lot of us have been working on the Web3 public goods kind of like explosion of projects. So things like Gitcoin, which are also even kind of older than 2020, but lots of experiments in the Gitcoin community, the selling point community, the funding the commons community, programs like PGF, programs like SourceGrid in the past, programs like HyperCerts. There's been kind of this massive explosion of mechanisms. Now, this stuff hasn't yet come into the Filecoin network for two reasons. One, we didn't have a VM, so it was hard for us to like use that. And second, We just hadn't done it. We hadn't taken the time to kind of go do it. So that's what I think we need to do this year. This year is about like bringing all of the on-chain structures and mechanisms to be able to do this kind of funding in the same way that like the rest of the Web3 ecosystem is doing, and start integrating our funding structures with those of other ecosystems. So I'll kind of like flag some, critical successes and challenges. So successes include like, we developed Filecoin itself, which is a huge result. We built and maintained tons of critical public goods for the ecosystem. We have run many separate programs with different focus areas, which is a huge success. You don't want a single program because that tends to be like, will kind of like underserve other structures. Now, in terms of challenges, it's not very scalable. It's really hard to select what matters most because we don't have good ways of like integrating a lot of the community opinion. We have no Web3 native mechanisms. We're not on chain yet. And that kind of introduces massive overhead and friction in running any of these kinds of programs. So it's like harder to do, harder to scale, harder to coordinate. We also lack strong iterative loops, meaning structures with like a very explicit like run around, reflect on the round, see what went well, what went poorly, reshape the program, and then run it again. Those kinds of structures end up being extremely effective at like very quickly iterating to improving the system. And while every program has its own notion of kind of like improvement and upgrading, we sort of like lack a whole ecosystem-wide notion of like, how are we doing as a whole? What should we improve? How should we change things? And adding that, I think, could be really good. We also lack a strong regen funding loop, meaning we don't have a good way right now to couple the success of the Filecoin economy as a whole into the success of public goods funding at the moment. And I think that's like a really critical thing long term. So yeah, let's go and take like all the good structures from the PGF ecosystem and bring them to Filecoin. So in terms of like how to do this long term, I'm gonna give a talk about this later in the year. That's kind of like deeper. But the kind of like the kind of like key points are: one, we should like leverage these on-chain structures and on-chain mechanisms. Two, we should have a robust way of experimenting with lots of different structures and ideas, and kind of to evaluate what's working really well and what's kind of rate limiting, so that we can kind of improve quickly. Three, we should orient towards deeply connecting these structures to the success of Filecoin itself, so that as Filecoin succeeds in certain areas, it like compounds the results. This is like one of the things that's I think working extremely well in the optimism ecosystem, which we'll hear about. And fourth, I think that in the long term, you want the Filecoin economy success to drive, to be so deeply connected here that we're talking about kind of routing currency into public goods funding directly at a chain level. There's lots of different proposals around the ecosystem now. There's lots of different proposals across the whole Web3 ecosystem about how to do this. One of the coolest and most exciting things is how Optimism is routing its like sequencer fees directly into public goods funding. I think that's going to be like a super advantage. I'm also starting to see lots of networks include like PGF structures in their initial like token allocations and emission constructions, which is I think super intelligent, and it's going to be super effective. Cool. So let's kind of now narrow down to 2024. Like, what should we do this year to kind of help realize this kind of long-term potential? I have a few things here. So one, I think we need to do our funding in kind of like a network-oriented way. What I mean by that is that if you look at like capital structures that are very effective at funding extremely complicated environments, and VC is a good example of this. When you have a very large-scale, multi-dimensional space where it's actually quite difficult to find what is really going to work well, systems that are evolutionary, that produce kind of networks of funding, end up outperforming single large-scale structures. So like VC kind of can be broken down into like this sort of structure where you have like a kind of like layered neural network style architecture to over time find and fit what actually matters in that to fund in that ecosystem. And so when you kind of like think about this, what's really going on is like you have capital flowing in both directions, kind of like feeding forward into funding projects. If those projects end up being successful, you get like a backprop success signal. And over time, this network is learning what is relevant to fund in the venture capital problem space. So, and that leads to a pretty good distribution in the funding staircase. So it's kind of hard to see here, but the background shows a kind of funding staircase of various different levels. And there's very good, robust distribution of many VC entities across these different scales that are able to fund projects at every possible stage, which is like, I think, one of the key reasons why VC has been so successful in the last, few decades. Comparatively, when you think about impact-oriented funding, you have a very skewed distribution globally. First off, the world is super generous, which is great, but a lot of that generosity is either like in tiny donations at the very bottom, which are kind of like hard to coordinate and hard to get, and a lot of it is unfortunately wasted. And then you have very few organizations at these larger and larger scales, which leads to very hyper centralization of perspective, which tends to underfund lots of critical projects. And this outcome, this kind of lopsided outcome, comes from the fact that impact funding tends not to be networked. You don't see the same kind of network structures in impact funding the way that you do in VC, because there's no way to do transitive funding here. The thing that achieves this is the kind of like carry structure, and we don't have any kind of like equivalent today for impact funding. However, a set of us are kind of like working on designing those kinds of structures. But anyway, like the easy way to do it today is to just start thinking about programs as nodes in these kinds of networks and routing funding from like larger groups to smaller groups to let them experiment and find what's important to solve, and treat this whole thing as an evolutionary system where you like give new, you like form new grant making programs or like, impact funder programs. You let those experiment, you let those have impact. You then, in a round structure, you decide whether to increase the funding or decrease the funding at the next scale. And if you just do that, over time, you can encourage lots of participants to figure out what's important to fund. Cool. So that's kind of like the network funding piece. The second thing that I think we need to do is to move a lot of Filecoin public goods funding on chain. So like move it to FEM so that we can kind of like make it much more introspectable and observable. So that means like we know all the projects, we know all the participants, we can like play with smart contracts to do a lot of the mechanisms. And so I think that this could be like super, super valuable. And then we want to kind of experiment with new mechanisms and programs. There's a lot of really good things that have come out over time. Lots of like different ideas for what we could do. I think initially what we should do, just kind of focus on, is taking the things that are working really well elsewhere and just implementing them in our ecosystem. After that, we can then start experimenting with lots of new possible things, and then kind of start participating in the conversation. It'll be hard enough to like boot up these programs as they are. I just like strongly encourage groups to like not try to change them very much right now, because if you try to like build and implement something new and change it, like that's going to be way harder. So let's just first look around and replicate what's working really well. And then after that, we can then go and like start changing it and improving it and so on. So I want to flag like 3 things, actually 4 things. I forgot 1/4. Fill retro PGF, which we'll talk about later. I think we should move towards like using a Gitcoin style quadratic funding structure. There's a thing called the PL Dev Guild where we're going to experiment just funding people, like not projects, just like funding people, which is kind of an interesting take on funding. And the 4th one that I didn't mention is drips. So we'll hear about drips later today. It'd be great to start funding dependencies with a drip structure. Cool. The last 2 things I want to kind of call for is, A, we need more impact funders, meaning like lots of participants benefit from the Filecoin community and Filecoin ecosystem. You as groups need to like help fund and develop these public goods. So it's kind of like a call for parties that want to shape the Filecoin network and what the Filecoin network does should do so by funding impact. And we need more region loops. So find more places where there's strong ways of aligning incentives such that like economic success will translate to more public goods funding, which will then fuel more economic success and so on. And so find those region loops and implement them. Cool. So that's a lot. Sorry for blathering at everybody for a while. Thank you very much.